This is a Relativity Series bonus episode from LA TheaterWorks and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, bridging science and the arts in the modern world. Here's our producing director, Susan Lowenberg.
I'm joined now by Dava Sobel, the playwright of And the Sun Stood Still and the author of A More Perfect Heaven, How Copernicus Revolutionized the Cosmos. Ms. Sobel is a former New York Times science reporter and a contributor to other publications, including Audubon, Discover, Life, Omni, and The New Yorker. Her book, Galileo's Daughter, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in the year 2000. Sobel is currently the Joan Lehman Jacobson visiting nonfiction writer at Smith College, where she teaches science writing. Her latest book, The Glass Universe, will be published in the fall of 2016. Dava Sobel, welcome to LA TheaterWorks, and thanks for joining us.
I'm happy to be here.
Dava, can you give us a snapshot of Copernicus, the whole person? Who he was outside of what we know, of course, but who he was as a whole human being.
We tend to think of him as a marble bust, but he really was a whole human being, orphaned at about age 10, and then privileged to this excellent education and advanced education. So he was in school in Krakow, and then he was in Bologna and Padua. And then he had a life in the church, which paid him extremely well. He probably had a love life. He had a female housekeeper whose presence drove the bishop crazy. In fact, a few of the very few surviving letters concern this housekeeper and how the bishop was pressuring Copernicus to get rid of her because it looked bad for him to have this unmarried woman living with him. But he always managed to find a reason why she couldn't leave just yet. So I like to think that he had love in his life. He had a great roving intelligence, so he could master mathematics, the motions of the heavens. He also came up with an economic theory. There was grave problems with the currency in his day, and he wrote up a plan for the revision of the currency, which he submitted to the King of Poland, and which was actually enacted. So he had tremendous influence and intelligence. Then he had this young renegade come visit him, and old and set in his ways as he was able to rise to the challenge of preparing his book for publication. And who knows what he did to finesse Rheticus, who was definitely a Lutheran, staying in a place where Lutherans were outlawed. But somehow they did that, and they worked on the book together. And then he agreed to see it published. And he must have been so invested in it because even though he suffered a stroke and couldn't really have any correspondence, didn't know what was happening toward the end of the publication, he just hung on until the final printed pages arrived and were put in his hands. And the colleague who was taking care of him reported that and they put the pages in his hands, and he breathed his last. So I almost didn't put that in the play because it sounded just too melodramatic for words, but it is something that really happened.
How did the idea for the play come about, and what interested you specifically in exploring Copernicus's story?
The idea came to me more than 30 years ago. I should do the math. It was 1973 because it was the 500th anniversary of Copernicus's birth, and there was a big article about him in Sky and Telescope that told the story of how he'd been talked into publishing his crazy idea. And that circumstance interested me so much because Copernicus was already in his 60s when he received a visit from a young mathematician who convinced him to do what he had avoided doing for a lifetime. And he published his book. And I thought that story of the meeting between the two of them was so unlikely, so interesting.
So this was Rheticus who came
This
to
was
visit him.
Rheticus.
Yes.
His name was Georg Joachim Rheticus, and he was a mathematics professor in Wittenberg in Germany. And Copernicus was Catholic and lived in northern Poland, where all the Lutherans had been banished. So even for Rheticus to show up at Copernicus's doorstep was dangerous. He was an illegal alien. But he arrived by surprise, and Copernicus managed to keep him there somehow for 2 years while they worked together and got the theory in truly publishable form. And then Rheticus is the one who took it back to Germany and had it published in Nuremberg. And I thought, everybody knows this meeting took place, but what did they say to each other? How did that conversation go?
And you reimagined the conversation.
Exactly. It seemed like it was dying to be a play.
So apparently Copernicus was quite old when he received the visit from Rheticus. How long had Copernicus been away from his formal studies of astronomy by this point? And why had he stopped?
Well, his formal studies were as a young man, as a university student. After that, he went to work for the Catholic Church, but he continued to do astronomy. So, although he was far removed from formal studies, he was not really removed from the formal pursuit of astronomy. He was making observations and thinking about things and writing and corresponding with other mathematicians.
You wrote the play several years before publishing your biography of Copernicus and his ideas, A More Perfect Heaven, in 2011. Did this book evolve out of the play, or did you have the germ for both ideas at the same time?
The book definitely evolved out of the play. I always saw this as a play, and I wanted it to be historically accurate, so I did as much research as I would do for any nonfiction project. And I mentioned to my publisher once that I was collecting all this background information, and at production time, I could give all this material to the director for dramaturgical purposes. And the publisher said, well, you ought to take all that material and write a book around the play so you could explain the genesis of the idea, what happened up until the time of the meeting. And then you put the play in the middle of the book where you imagine the meeting, and then pick up the story again and trace the impact of the book to the present day. And that sounded like a great idea, so that's what I did.
We learn in the opening moments of the play that rather than practicing astronomy, Copernicus is instead making his living as a physician. How did he enter into the field of medicine, and how extensively did he practice it throughout his life?
Soon after his college education, his uncle, who was the bishop of his diocese, sent him to Italy to go to medical school. First he went to law school, then he went to medical school, because they were preparing him for a career in church administration. And they thought if he was also a doctor, then he could take care of the bishop and the other members of the church community. There were 16 top administrators in this church, and he was their doctor. So he really did practice medicine.
In your biography of Copernicus, you note that he was raised by his uncle, who was a member of the Catholic clergy and who went on to become the Bishop of Varmia himself. What sort of influence did he have on Copernicus, and how did he steer Copernicus towards a life in the church?
He had a tremendous influence. He at first sent him to college, to the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, where he himself had been a student. And so Copernicus had the tremendous advantage of that education. And then his uncle, being the bishop, had a lot of pull. And when one of those cushy jobs opened, he inserted the young Copernicus into it. So a huge influence.
And how comfortable was Copernicus living and working within the church system? And how did he balance his political and spiritual obligations with his scientific work?
I doubt that he ever felt any mismatch between his scientific work and his religious beliefs, because he's on record as saying that the study of astronomy is a way to appreciate the power and glory of God. There's nothing more beautiful than the heavens. So if you are contemplating the workings of the heavens, then you're in a very high spiritual realm. He was also very grounded. He worked for a few years at one of the satellite palaces of his diocese, where he collected rents from the peasants who rented the church land. And he got to know them and probably ministered to them medically and spiritually. So I think it was all fairly seamless, the many activities he engaged in.
So how did Copernicus draw upon existing ideas about cosmology and the order of the universe in creating his heliocentric model? And who were some of his most significant forebears?
He mentions Ptolemy. Ptolemy is the person who put the geocentric system into the best mathematical order. But there were still a lot of problems with it. You have to fudge a lot of things to pretend that the Earth is at the center. And Copernicus objected to some of the fudging. And he was looking for a way to restore heavenly motions to perfect circles, that everything should move at a uniform speed and in perfect circles. And in doing that, he was probably aware of some of the work done by Arabic astronomers in the Middle Ages, who had the same argument with Ptolemy about the perfect circles. But none of the Arabic astronomers ever put the sun in the center. They were able to jiggle the circles into better order and leave the Earth in the center of everything. So Copernicus's great breakthrough vision, unifying thought, was to put the sun in the middle, because that explained so much about why the planets sometimes went backwards. It all came together if you put the sun in the middle. And he never explains how or why he came to that. He just came to it. Maybe he had a divine revelation.
Talk a little bit about how that idea runs counter to Christian theology and why it was so threatening.
Christian theology was very close to the teachings of Aristotle, also a geocentric worldview. And there are sections of the Bible that talk about the foundations of the earth, how God set the earth on its foundation, not to be moved forever. So to say that the earth is actually in motion could be interpreted as a heretical statement. And Copernicus was aware of that, and it gave him pause. He was afraid that people would twist the idea and try to make it sound irreligious. He was also very afraid of being laughed at because the idea sounded insane.
So at what point did Copernicus publish his initial ideas on cosmology, and how widely were they distributed?
In about 1510, so in his 30s, he wrote a long letter explaining the gist of the idea and sent that to some people he knew would be interested. That was an age without scientific journals. So the way to get your ideas about was through correspondence. And then the people you wrote to would also have a circle of correspondence, and they were allowed, they knew this was cricket, to copy your letter and send it to their friends. And then people would be discussing things. But it wasn't published in a way that you would call publishing. wasn't printed as a book. So it was just making the rounds among the people who were knowledgeable about mathematics, about the motions of the heavens, which would have been a relatively small group of people who could all read and write Latin so they could communicate with one another, even though they lived in different countries. And that's how Rheticus knew what Copernicus was doing. He heard from one of these people in the informal network of communication and was very interested in the work, and so took the trouble to travel to Poland and seek him out.
Given that at least some of these ideas predated him, what were Copernicus's unique innovations in the science behind placing the sun at the center of the universe?
He put it in a complete mathematical framework. Other astronomers of the time were making different rules for the various planets. His system was consistent throughout, which was its great power and beauty, even though the idea of the moving Earth continued to really bother people.
And when Rheticus appeared on the scene and wanted this work to become more widely publicized, talk about Copernicus's concerns and his hesitation.
Well, he had been writing a book for about 30 years. In his letter to other mathematicians of the time, he had said that he was going to write a book and explain everything in detail. And then nobody ever heard from him. Decades went by, the book never came out. But he had apparently concluded by that point that it would be foolhardy to publish this book, perhaps dangerous. So he probably meant to have a very neatly assembled manuscript. The manuscript survives, and it's a beautiful thing. So it looks like he meant it to be a record of all his thoughts, and that probably he would have that in the cathedral library as the summary of his life work. But it wasn't going anywhere else. Rheticus wanted it published. He was an astrologer. That's what you really, if you were making your living as an astronomer in the 1500s, you were really an astrologer. You were casting horoscopes. And as far as anyone knows, Copernicus did not do that. It's possible he did, but he never wrote anything about it that survives. Whereas Rheticus wrote a good deal about astrology and had done his own horoscope, which did not look good, and which made me think that was one of the reasons he sought out Copernicus, that he thought perhaps there was better hope for him with a different system of heavenly arrangements.
So you think that may have been a primary motivation on Rheticus's part instead of just...
I do, and since I was writing a play, I was free to imagine those sorts of things.
Yeah. What kinds of primary sources did you use in drafting the relationship between Rheticus and Copernicus in your play?
There are a few letters from Copernicus that survive, and because of the big anniversary celebration in 1973, everything has been translated into English. I certainly read the book, Copernicus's book. There are at least 3 English translations. They're all equally dense, not really great reading. Rheticus was a much better writer, very lively, and his letters and works were a great help. And one of the most interesting things I read were Copernicus's notes from the time he was the rent collector, because he talked about all his interactions with the peasants. And you could see that he was a really decent guy, very fair-minded. And if there was an elderly couple working a farm with no children to help them, he would lower the rent, or he would give them a horse. He would find some way to make their lives easier. And he wrote all these things down.
Getting back to Rheticus and Copernicus, is there any existing correspondence or working papers between the two men that might illuminate their friendship or mentorship?
Once Rheticus took the book to Nuremberg, they were in correspondence because Copernicus was making corrections. And even before that, while Rheticus was working with Copernicus, he wrote to the mathematician who had first told him of Copernicus's ideas and said how much he was enjoying being with him and referred to Copernicus as my teacher. And in his later writings, he always spoke of him as a father, a teacher and a father. So it's clear that they were very close.
And what became of Rheticus after Copernicus's death?
Well, Copernicus died while the book was on press, and Rheticus was supposed to be proofreading the whole thing. But during the printing process, which was very lengthy, he was offered a teaching job in Leipzig that was better than his job in Wittenberg, and much higher salary. So it was an offer he really couldn't refuse, and he left. And while teaching, years after Copernicus's death, a formal complaint was lodged against him by the father of one of his students that Rheticus had forced this young man to become inebriated and then sodomized him. And that was a crime punishable by death at that time. So he did not wait around to defend himself, but just left town and never came back. And one of the things he did in the following years was to go to medical school himself. And he wrote a great deal. And against his own predictions, he lived to be 60.
So who finished proofreading the Copernicus manuscript?
Rheticus turned over the job to a person named Andreas Osiander, who was known to both Rheticus and Copernicus. He had been a Catholic priest, but he had converted, as so many people did in the Protestant Reformation, and now he was a Protestant minister, but conversant with these ideas. And he had urged Copernicus not to present the idea as reality, that he should talk about it in a hypothetical way. And once he had control of the book on the press, he inserted an anonymous preface that basically said, don't take any of this too seriously. You know, people can't really know what goes on in astronomy unless it's divinely revealed. So if you think you know what's really going on, then you're a fool. And people reading the book, that's the first thing that they read. So it had an interesting effect on the readership, and probably a protective effect.
That's very interesting. I mean, with that kind of disclaimer, how did the book become such an important milestone in the annals of astronomy?
The book was seen as important immediately because it was a great big book. It was expensive, and it was extremely scholarly, well thought out. Many ideas about figuring the orbits of the planets were done better in Copernicus's book, and people recognized that immediately. Many of them just skipped over the opening chapters, which talked about the Earth in motion, and just got right to the hardcore spherical geometry parts. There are annotated editions that survive that really show how the book was read and interpreted. And it wasn't till years later, till Kepler and Galileo, that people read the book and said, whoever wrote this preface was not really reading Copernicus, because he obviously is serious about this. And Galileo, especially after his telescope discoveries, began speaking out about Copernicus and speaking out about the reality of an Earth in motion. And that was when Copernicus's book came to the attention of the Holy Index and found a place on the index of prohibited books.
And that was in what year?
1616. So long after its publication in 1543.
And if you were on the index, did it prohibit people from obtaining the book?
It depended. And in Copernicus's case, he was in a special category, suspended until corrected. So if you had the book, you were supposed to write in it the corrections that the index stipulated a few years later. And there are surviving copies from Italy, including Galileo's own copy, that have all these corrections written in. Outside of Italy, nobody bothered. So it was not outright banned. It just needed to be corrected.
Well, Dava Sobel, thank you so much for speaking with us today. This was fascinating.
Oh, this has been fun.
I've been speaking with Dava Sobel, the playwright of And the Sun Stood Still, and the author of A More Perfect Heaven, How Copernicus Revolutionized the Cosmos.